Sounds like Jason's taking off, so I guess we will too. That clock's a little bit slower. I'm a little fast, so you're right. Simmer down. So when we left off Sunday, we just had gotten into chapter 3 of the book of James. We had just started talking about verse 2. We'll start back here in just a moment. Jeff's going to open us up in a word of prayer tonight.
Our God, as we come now, we just want to thank you for a beautiful day that you've given us today, Lord, and the temperatures that are giving us a hint of the season to come, dear Lord. And we just want to thank you for the blessings of this day in our life, and Father. But at this time, during this hour, dear Lord, we want to thank you that you've given the opportunity to come together here this evening to assemble in our classes and to study your word, Heavenly Father. We ask your blessings to be on Sam as well as all the other teachers here this evening. We pray that you would be with them and help them and encourage them, as well as those of us who are here to study your word, Heavenly Father. We ask your blessings to be upon us and encourage us this week. In Jesus' name we pray.
Yeah, thank you. So in James chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, we'll start off there with a little bit of review and jump right into this. My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Start off there in verse 1, my brethren. Again, he's speaking to fellow Christians, and he goes on speaking about teachers have a greater condemnation or a more severe judgment. We spoke about some reasons why that may be, and one reason because that they can lead souls of the people astray by false teaching. We read a passage, 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 3. Teachers having itching ears. Folks will lust after things that they want to hear, and they'll heap up to themselves teachers that'll tell them what they want to hear, and these teachers will go along with it. Also, a greater condemnation because of their influence on others by the example that they set. We end up saying that this shouldn't be a discouragement to teachers, but should be a warning to help those who choose to teach to understand that by their example and doctrine that they will not only endanger their souls but also those that hear them. Again, it should not be a discouragement, but it should be also seen as an opportunity to glorify God and to provide the knowledge of salvation to a lost soul. We have an opportunity to create more teachers. Brings us into verse 2. James is showing his human faults here and his human weaknesses as he admits when he says, we have offended. He admits that he has offended some by his words, and maybe that's the reason, possibly the reason for this admonition. Offend, just some definitions that help me. Offend means to stumble, to fall, then to err, or to fail in duty, meaning that all are liable to commit error, and such should be cautious in seeking an office where an error would be likely to do so much injury, as we spoke about. I came across one thought that I really, I liked it, but it kind of hurt. It said, a person who does not curb his tongue has a deeper problem within because, as Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 12, verse 34, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. A person who does not curb his tongue has a deeper problem within because Jesus taught out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And that hit me. It hit me really hard. Sometimes out of frustrations, usually. I've been known to say rash things, or I'm told I say rash things, and often may try to excuse those things because I was just frustrated and I really didn't mean that. But the issue came out of me; it's in my heart, and that's a problem. So this is a really great reminder for me. But James continues to illustrate just how much of a problem that the tongue is and the tongue can be, and how difficult it is to control. We're going to get into some of his illustrations here. But are there any comments before we go much further?
Another thing, because the Bible teaches that every idle word we're going to be judged by if we think, if we just stop and think, like that slow to speak, if we
And we'll get into some of this. And even if we're not judged on those words, the damage they can do to our ripple. I mean, to the ripple effects within our circles. I mean, the damage is many times cannot be undone. So by us. Anything else? In verses 3 through 5, could someone read those, please? Verses 3 through 5.
Now, if we put the bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also. For they are so great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things.
So James, he's using three analogies here to illustrate how small things can regulate or how they can control much larger objects. Well, first we start off there with the horse. I mean, horses, they're huge. I hate horses. They scare me to death. They're too powerful. You can't control them. I can't control them. But they can be controlled. With this small thing you put in their mouth, they can be controlled. Verse 3, James rephrases the words from Psalms chapter 32 and verse 9. We read Psalms 32 verse 9, "Be ye not as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee." And I don't know really anything about horses other than they're big. But a bit in a horse's mouth enables us, the rider or the controller, to turn the whole body of the horse. So the person who can control their own tongue has the mastery of their whole body. That's what he's saying. In verse, anybody else want anything about a horse? I hate horses. They scare me to death. You're a horse guy. I'm sorry.
I love horses. You gotta let them know you're wrong.
Yeah.
You can't let them know you're afraid.
Right. That sounds like a kid to me. So. Verse 4, so, the rudder is also a really small thing, but it enables, I'm not sure what your version said, but the King James says that the steersman to guide the ship wherever he will. And I think in spite of the storm, that was one of the rabbit holes, I guess, in spite of the storm. The helm is not that big of a deal if the waters are calm, but if you've got a storm happening, it's important to be able to be in control of that ship. And one thought that I read refers to the ship here to an image of ourselves, and the wind to the impulses of our own minds, which we are driven side to side. And that idea, along that line, are there winds of life that cause distractions? Absolutely. Absolutely. We know of Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Remember Peter, as he walked on the water to our Lord, how the storms and the wind distracted, and he lost his focus on Jesus, and he began to sink. So these simple illustration from the reading there that reminds me of the storms in my life and how easy it is to get distracted. But with these first two comparisons, the horse and the ship show what mastery can be gained by self-discipline. The third, in verse 5, seems to be warn the readers of a danger that may quickly spread beyond the power to subdue it. Verse 5 says, "Even so," or like that small rudder of a mighty ship which determines the course, the tongue, though a little member, can cause all sorts of trouble. And just to your point you was making mention a moment ago, it's if we just kind of breathe. Somebody said the other day the rule of three: breathe in for 3 seconds, hold it for 3 seconds, and breathe out for 3 seconds. And I don't know who said that, but I've used that a few times since. James continues to stress the topic that he began back in chapter 1 of verse 19 about being slow to speak. And I think it's spot on. He's continuing to grow this idea. We mentioned it again in chapter 1 and verse 26 about acting religious and your tongue telling otherwise. And then most of chapter 2, having your actions back up your words. So be caution and be certain of those words. Especially in verse 5 here, with dealing with how great a matter little fire kindleth. While studying this, I thought about the 2016 Gatlinburg fires. how small fire with strong winds and drought conditions, created the perfect conditions that caused complete devastation, claiming 14 lives, 190 injured folks, millions in damages, and estimated 2,400 buildings affected. So again, verse 5, behold how great a matter a little fire kindles. With so few harsh words, and we spoke about this a moment ago, unmeasurable and often unrepairable damages can occur. At least unrepairable within our own capabilities. Can you
Proverbs 12, I think, makes a great comparison here. Maybe contrasting the two ways that we can go with our speech. Proverbs chapter 12, verses 17 through 19 says, he who speaks truth declares righteousness, but a false witness deceit. There is one who speaks like the piercing of the sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. The truthful lip shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. I think that just very well illustrates how great the power of our words is, and yet it can go either way. It can be a great power for good. It can be a great power in declaring righteousness, in declaring truth, in declaring wisdom in the things of God. Or it can be a great power for evil. It can be a great power deceiving and luring people toward death.
Right. Great point.
We studied in Tom's past, back in chapter 12 of Tom, about associating the flattering tongue with the person that has a double heart. People try to serve two masters off the tongue and flesh. That's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah.
Flattering lips. In Psalms 83, it says, Lord, may you cut the flattering lip off.
Yeah.
That deals with the divided heart. That goes on along with what you read again. When you see the one, when you see the flattering lip, you've seen a double heart.
Yeah.
That's what we're regarding. Partly how we can tame it with our tongue. We can control it by having a non-divided heart.
Right. It's good. Good.
As you brought out, what comes out of here speaks what's in here.
Yep.
Safeguard what comes in here. We'll be able to control it.
Good point. Which what you said, pretty well sums up 6 through 8. Pretty well 6 through 8. So could someone read that, please? Verse 6 through 8.
And the tongue is fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hail. For every kind of beast and bird and reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. And no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison.
The language here is just really, really strong. But if unrestrained, if unbridled, if untamed, the tongue can consume or destroy people's lives. And that's just glaring. Why is that? Because it's a fire. It's a world of sin, unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Seems reflected of the words of Jesus to the scribes and the Pharisees back in Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, verse 34 through 37. We read, Matthew chapter 12, beginning verse 34. O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of the treasure of the heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. But I say unto you, that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by your words thou shalt be condemned. That's terrifying. That's terrifying. One phrase in here that I really had to look at. I've read over this over and over. I just kind of glanced over it, I guess, most of my life. In verse, Verse 6, and sets on fire the course of nature. I had to look in that, but the course of nature says literally the wheel, the orb of creation, the idea of the generations of men, one generation going on and another coming without intermission. Meaning the tongue has set on fire our forefathers, it inflames us, and it will have the same influence on those who come after us. Just the nature of things. The tongue just, we don't learn, I guess. We don't learn from those before us. Wild beasts can be tamed, but the tongue must always be kept under control by the use of those proper restraints. In verse 8, it says, if it's not restrained, it's an unruly evil. And that phrase scares me. Unruly evil. That just sounds like one of those absolutely terrified horror movies. Unruly evil. Full of deadly poison, in that it acts on the happiness of man. We see lives destroyed by things people say. The peace of society, nations turned upside down, just like poison venom does on the human body. In Romans chapter 3. Someone care to read Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 18?
As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands, there is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside, they have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. Their throat is an open tomb, with their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood, destruction and misery are their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes.
That's pretty dark. That's a pretty dark outlook. Verse 13, their throat is an open sepulchre, grave. Their tongues, they have used deceit. The poison of asp is in their lips. Our language matters. Verse 18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Maybe we've seen it, but I'm certain that we've heard of it, how words can destroy friendships and families and churches and nations and ultimately man's entire well-being. And in James, in chapter 3, he's giving warning to whomever's willing to listen. Beware. Anything else through verse 8?
One thing to address what you said in verse 6, just a possible thought. New American Standard has in there that sets on fire the course of our life.
Okay.
We're talking about here, we're speaking of, we're reading about the tongue. We're talking about the tongue is not autonomy, we're talking about the words that are spoken. And this, as you just pointed out, what I speak isn't just for all me. It will affect all in your life. So this gets into every relationship. Children are often,
Yeah.
but where do they learn greatness? In the words of adults. It can be the words of parents, the tone of voice. But these words that children hear, this is how, when they hear gossip, when they hear venting, anger, arguing, this is setting their life on course. This is the danger of the misuse of words on the tongue. And that's why we need, James says, be very careful.
Yep.
Because you don't just protect yourself. You never know, and we all know, here's the thing, I'm very tempted to think tonight.
Yep.
That's what they're hearing.
And they'll repeat it in the most inconvenient places.
But we're setting on course. We're setting their life on the
Yep.
course by the words they hear from us. And as you say, brethren, churches, this is what causes the biggest division. Untamed words. And it's like James points out, guard.
I mean, it's a biggest, probably the biggest, well, one of the biggest messages in the whole book. I mean, it starts in chapter 1, it goes through chapter 2, and then we're chapter 3. So I mean, it's a big deal, big deal. I mean, I need to understand that it's a big deal. Anything else? In verse 9, the King James reads, therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. The ASB in the same verse, I mean, it's similar, but it says, therewith bless we the Lord and Father, and therewith curse we men, who are made in the likeness of God. And we understand this. The tongue is capable of praising God 1 minute, and then the next minute cursing his fellow man who is in the likeness of God. In Proverbs 18 and verse 21, this is one of our passages from last quarter's class about choices. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. So do we choose life or do we choose death by our words? I mean, we do it. We make decisions every single day, how we react to our spouse or to our children or to our coworkers or to the community or to our brethren. I mean, just to add to that thought, in 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4 in verse 20, we read, if a man say, I love God, and he hates his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? Now, I mean, this is the principle. This is the principle, and I've heard it. This idea said, talking out of both sides of your mouth, type thing. And I think that's how I understand this. If we're blessing God and cursing or talking down or slanders to our brethren, and that's hypocritical. It's hypocritical. You can't do that. You can't do that. And he goes on to say in verse 10, brethren, these things should not happen. They ought not to be. Just to use some other passages, Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 6. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 6. The words of the wicked are to lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright shall deliver them. We just show that this huge comparison about the words, how we use our mouth. It can be used to destroy or used to help. Similarly, in Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. So whatever words that we're spewing out of our mouth, as believers, those words should build up whomever hears them and not have the opposite effect. And that's what I'm gathering from what James is saying here. Anything from anybody else?
Starting in verse 7, there's a lot that he says, but it really seems to draw your mind back to Genesis. Every species of beasts and birds, reptiles, creatures of the sea. And then this idea that they were tamed by mankind, by the human race. All of this kind of draws your mind back to what God did in the beginning. God created all things, God created man. He put man in put the animals in subjection to man, put them to reign over them. And what's interesting is when we go back to that, what we find is, and maybe the reason James draws our mind back to that, and he brings it back up again in verse 9, is out of all that creation, we're made in God's image. That doesn't mean that Christians are made in God's image. It means that all mankind is created in God's image. We certainly stained that and soiled that with sin, but that's the kind of the founding thing that we all share in common, that when we were created in the image of God. seems to be a Jewish rabbinical teaching that notion was woven into the way that they talked, the way that they treated people around them. There was a Jewish law that claimed, let no one say of their neighbor, let him be ashamed, for you are calling shame upon one who is in the image of God. And it brings to mind and whether or not Jesus was quoting this law or not, it brings to mind what Jesus said about how dangerous our words are in Matthew chapter 5, verse 22. He said, anyone that is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Sanhedrin. Whoever says you fool shall be guilty enough to go into the fires of hell. I think the way that we look on everything that we've said is so valuable to think about, to be slow to speak, to think about things for a while, the 3, 3, and 3 rule. But that person we're getting ready to slander, that person that we're getting ready to gossip, that person that has got on our last nerve, we're about ready to just let them have it. God made them. And He made them in His image. And if you come to my boy and you just rip into him, that affects him. And I think we should think the same thing of our God as well.
Great point. Anybody else?
And verse 1 of this chapter almost seems displaced from the rest of what we're talking about, unless it's not really talking about false doctrine as much as it's talking about the way we live. Because it goes right into that and says, be careful being a teacher, because you can make all these other mistakes with your tongue. And obviously false teaching will be one of those, but it isn't what he's focused on in those next few passages. I don't know what my exact conclusion is there, except we probably think about that passage most often in terms of false doctrine, and I'm not sure that it's not more about morality. I don't know what the right word is.
Totally agree. I totally see that. I mean, even back in chapter 2, we're still talking to brethren and we're showing favoritism. I mean, these are major characteristic flaws.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably solely because it's got a big 3 in front of it that we do that.
Yeah.
And so you take that verse and you pull it out, and it terrifies people of becoming preachers and teachers. It should terrify all of us, of people who live lives that claim faith but don't have any works to show that.
Yes.
People who claim to be religious, but their lives show they are practicing defiled religion. People whose mouths spout off without thinking. All of them, you need to be careful with what they're teaching other people around.
I mean, at least in my own life, I apply this most personally as a parent. I mean, just dealing with those little sponges that are with me, as Roger said. I mean, they're mimics. They're going to copy absolutely everything. Things that people don't see during the day's time. During the day, they see in the evening or at home or at night, whatever. I mean, they know you intimately. So, anyway, good point. Good point. All right, verses 11 and 12. We got some rhetorical questions here. 11 and 12. Does a fountain send forth at the same place sweet water and bitter? Can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries, either a vine figs? So can no fountain both yield salt water and fresh. So, the answer is there. So, no. Obvious answer is no. Since these things can happen, and so is it absurd for a tongue to utter praises to God and with the same tongue utter words of hatred for others. They don't mix. They're antis. They don't go together. Jesus stresses this idea of inconsistent use of the tongue is certainly not approved. James stresses that this idea of inconsistent use of the tongue is certainly not approved of by God. And just as unnatural as it is for a tree to bear both fig and olives or a vine to produce fruit that comes from a fig tree, so is it also unnatural for a Christian to praise God and curse his fellow man from the same mouth. If our speech or if our mouth is inconsistent with our professed religion, then we're simply allowing our tongues to run loose, unbridled. And James says, brethren, this cannot be. This cannot be.
You know, it's interesting when you read that. One, we read curse and likely think foul language. In this context, it's really the opposite of blessing.
Yeah.
We're not speaking of blessings, we're speaking of curses. But he says, with the same mouth, blessings and cursings should not come up. Spring forth. God spoke blessings and curses in the same mouth. He told Israel, warned them repeatedly. If you obey me, you will be blessed. And if you disobey me, you will be cursed. If you are faithful to the covenant, you will receive blessing. If you are unfaithful and you go after the gods of this land, you will be cursed. I think if we kind of look back through that, one, we'll see that there are those who are, or maybe not, but there is one who is qualified to be able to speak both blessings and curses. And there are those who are called. And it's interesting, right after this, he's going to talk to them about who among you is wise and understanding. Let him show his good behaviors by his deeds and the gentleness of wisdom. As we grow closer to God, we should be having instilled in us the mind of God through the revelation of his word. And one might think that, and it seems to be obvious in our day, that gives me the ability to justify commanding curses on somebody, because God has done that in the past, and he did that on sinful people who were unfaithful, and so I should have the right as well. But I think you kind of see a notion here where we are like God, but we are never God. We never stand in that same position. He calls us to be those who spring forth blessings. As we grow in wisdom, that needs to show not in our ability to discern who gets the curses, but where our gentleness needs to be shown.
Yeah, and even in those cursings and judgments, it's all righteousness, and we don't have that ability. I don't have that ability. I'm too emotional, and I want what I want, and it's not fair. That's me. I'm not fair to those around me. So, point. Anything else? Kind of get into kind of a little bit of the next section here, 13 through 18, starts speaking about two different types of wisdom. Can somebody read that 13 through 18? We'll get through. We're moving right along, Miss Carol. We might get through all of this. We'll see. I mean, we'll try. Someone care to read 13 through 18? See how far we get.
Who is wise and understanding among you? That in conduct let him show his works and meekness and wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure and peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
All right, thank you. So, two types of wisdom. As we begin in verse 13, James couples some words here: knowledge and wisdom. He seems to be transitioning his teaching from sins of the tongue to knowledge of God's word and meekness or gentleness of wisdom. So, knowledge and wisdom. King James in verse 13 says, "Who is wise and equipped with knowledge among you?" And again, I mean, I agree with Michael. I still think we're speaking about these teachers throughout this right here, possibly having reference to anyone who desires to be a teacher from verse 1. And we've already discussed in previous classes that this would include I mean, all Christians. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12. I mean, we're all called to be teachers. So one who becomes endued with knowledge, as we read there in that verse, is one who has been properly instructed by study and rightly dividing the word of truth, and then putting into practice those things that have been learned. So to me, that seems like a really good, quick summation of the first part of James. Learn and do. Learn and do. And he uses these two words here: knowledge, which is one that's learned by understanding what the will of God is. So you're learning the information, and then wisdom is the ability to make proper application of that spiritual knowledge in this case. In this verse 13, the verse suggests that each teacher to do a self-examination and determine if they are wise and understanding. Wise with understanding, and also determine if they're worthy of the emulation. So I mean, from what we've studied so far, you think it's safe to say that most likely some of these Christians were lacking these qualities? Yeah, I think so too. And the same can be said for Christians in the Lord's church today. Do we have these qualities? Do we spend time? Do we learn? And those things we learn, do we apply? The second part of that verse, in verse 13, instructs the wise man who is endued with knowledge to put it to use with meekness of wisdom. This seems to be a follow-up from chapter 2. A wise believer will exhibit their knowledge and wisdom in what ways? Through works, right? Through the things they do. They exhibit their knowledge and wisdom through works, not just words only, but through their works. I think there's some comparable verses that we could look at this in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1. If anybody's willing to read these, my voice is getting kind of weak here. Galatians chapter 6, 1.
Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted.
Man, that's a great quality, right? I mean, you're going to approach your brother in the spirit of meekness or gentleness, right? And try to sway them back over. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 15. Uh, 4:15, Ephesians 4:15.
But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all our strength into Him who is the head.
All right, so we speak it in truth, or we speak the truth, but we speak it in love. Speak it in love. 2 Timothy chapter 2, 24 through 26. Well, and that's a meaty verse too. Not to be quarrelsome. I mean, if we have disagreements, it's easy to get all bent out of shape. But to be kind and to be patient, to correct. So stand up for the truth, but do it with gentleness and hopes that God will be glorified and that their soul will be released from the snare of the devil. Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Yes, sir. Yeah, man. No, have at it. Go ahead. Expand on that. That's.
As we're talking about what may be required for us to meekly correct someone, to think that is a one-shot revelation is pretty optimistic.
And a bit naive.
Yeah, better word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, potentially years or maybe a lifetime of dripping. This is good point. Titus chapter 3, verse 1 and 2.
Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always to be thankful to the Lord.
And man, that's hard to do too. Simple teaching, but it's not easy to do, right? Simple teaching, not easy to do. So, moving on into verse 14. If someone exhibits this idea of bitter envying and strife, it says they can't claim to have wisdom from above. Bitter envying and strife. So envy means to desire to deprive others of what they have. Man, that's just, I thought I knew what envy was, but write it down and think about it and read it. Envy means to desire to deprive another of what they have. Strife means contention and is the expression of enmity or may be understood as disputes. The ASV uses the words bitter jealousy and factions, which means a selfish spirit that seeks its own will. To me, that helps me understand the idea of this. Verse 14 says, but if you have bitter envyings and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. Concerning this attitude, Romans, the book of Romans, we have some information we can pick up there too. In Romans chapter 2, verse 8 and 9, the ASV says, but unto them that are factious and obey not the truth, but obey unrighteousness, shall be wrath and indignation, tribulation and anguish, upon every soul of man that worketh evil, of the Jew first and also the Greek. So to have this bitter jealousy and faction, I mean, there's nothing good going to come from that. Nothing good going to come from that. And it's certainly not from God. It's not wisdom from God. Probably the last passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 20. 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 20. It says, for I fear, lest by any means when I come, I should find you not as I would, but should myself be found of you such as you would not. Lest by any means there should be strife and jealousy and wraths, factions, backbitings, whisperings, swellings, tumults, and Paul goes on and on. So a person with a heart like this is not God's kind of true wisdom, because it promotes strife and contention and rivalry and makes brethren competitors one with another instead of workers together with Christ. Nothing good is going to come out of bitter jealousy and factions. If you have these things, don't be self-deceived. It's not wisdom from God. Anything else to add to that? We're getting ready to have this bell ring, and we'll stop, I think. We'll stop there and we'll pick back up on Sunday with, we'll finish talking about this this natural wisdom, this natural, earthly, sensual, devilish wisdom. Appreciate y'all's comments tonight.